It is a great pleasure to give some comments to two questions which you have raised with me. The UNIDROIT Convention on International Factoring, which was ratified in 1988 during a diplomatic conference in Canada, in Ottawa, therefore also known as the Ottawa Convention. The very positive aspect of the UNIDROIT Convention is that at least there are definitions of international factoring which have been ratified by a very large diplomatic conference and which subsequently have been accepted to be applicable to international trade by three major trading blocs, namely Germany, Italy and France. So trade between those countries handled on a factoring basis are governed by the UNIDROIT Convention. And there have been a number, not a large number, but there have been a number of court cases where between exporters and importers, arguments, disagreements, where the judge was bound to basically decide with keeping in mind the UNIDROIT Convention and what happens when an international factoring process is applicable. Unfortunately, that is the less positive side of the UNIDROIT Convention. Many more countries should have signed, and that unfortunately has not happened yet. So three major countries, France, Germany, France, Germany and Italy, and a number of smaller countries including Hungary. So the application to actual international trade is limited, but there are many countries which are looking at this convention as it is the one and only convention which is dealing with international factoring. Then the last question was regarding the GRIF, the FCI general rules for international factoring, and that is then for correspondent factoring between an export factor and an import factor, so the two-factor system. In that particular case, the GRIF has become the world standard, and if we look at cross-border factoring transactions in the world, 95% of that total world volume is going through members of Factors Chain International, and in the case that it is two-factor business, it is all done under the standard rules of the GRIF. The GRIF has become so much the dominant set of rules for international factoring that now also discussions have started with, for instance, the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, whether the ICC, which as a body has been regulating already for many years trade transactions under, for instance, LC and other documentary credit forms, whether also ICC wants to basically take over the GRIF as the universally accepted, and not only by FCI members but also by other parties, the universally accepted rules for factoring between correspondent factors. And that may then, in the case of the ICC, and in particular because it is the Banking Commission which is concerned with this whole issue, in the case of ICC it may mean primarily between banks. Banks with a factoring division acting as an export factor, and banks with a factoring division acting as import factor. For those transactions, the GRIF may eventually become the standard, even when those banks are not members of FCI. I wish you a very good conference in Moscow.